Following the first day of battle, Admiral Halsey and his officers decided to create a contingency plan to deal with the perceived threat in the area of the San Bernardino Strait. He planned to create a special task force called Task Force 34 that would be deployed should the enemy advance towards that area. He failed to be specific in when the task force would be formed, and this led to serious confusion amongst Halsey's subordinates as to the status of the ships that were to be involved in this task force. This led to the San Bernardino Strait being left completely unguarded as Halsey decided to take 3 of his groups north to attack what he believed to be the main strength of the Japanese fleet. This meant that much of the Allied strength was away from where much of the action would eventually take place. This miscommunication is central to the battle itself. Halsey's inability to effectively convey his orders led to serious deficiencies in the American defenses and allowed for them to be taken by surprise and by a much larger force. The Battle of the Surigao Strait was the last battleship versus battleship naval battle. This part of the battle was anticipated and planned for by both groups. The U.S. 7th Fleet, in this case, had better planning and was waiting for the Japanese Southern Fleet in the Surigao Strait when they arrived. This did not end well for the Japanese, as they were outmatched, outgunned, and taken by surprise. They were met by an array of attacks from U.S. battleships, destroyers, and torpedo boats. This entire varied arsenal that the U.S. had at its disposal was put to good use at this stage of the battle. The Southern Japanese force also did not have the necessary supplies to do battle with a force of this size, and several ships were sunk. The U.S. was also able to use battleship tactics more effectively. This is the last battle where the tactic of battleships crossing the T was used. In this tactic, a group of battleships cross in front of another battleship, allowing them to fire all of their guns, while only allowing the other battleships to fire their forward guns. The weather landscape were also taken advantage of by the U.S. The less favorable weather allowed for the U.S. to use its torpedoes to inflict heavy damage on the Japanese. This battle was the most lopsided portion of the battle, as the U.S.'s superiority was never in question. The Battle off of Samar on October 25th was a direct result of the miscommunications that had happened the day before. Nobody was available to prevent Kurita from moving toward the San Bernardino Strait and attacking the U.S. 7th Fleet. Once they reached the coast of Samar, they ran into the 7th Fleet's 3 escort carrier groups dubbed Taffy 1, 2, and 3. These groups consisted of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. These ships are not very armored and very lightly armed. Taffy 3 was caught almost completely off guard. The only thing that may have saved the group of ships was that Admiral Kurita thought he had found the bulk of Admiral Halsey's main force. Even though they had been beaten up in the previous 2 days of fighting, Kurita's central force was still very powerful and outmatched Taffy 1, 2, and 3. Yet, the commander of Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, counterattacked to the best of his ability. He had initially tried to retreat, but once unable, his ships put up a fight that may have prevented Kurita from further engaging the rest of the 7th Fleet. The ships of Taffy 3 came under heavy fire from both ships and aircraft that had been launched by the Japanese Central Fleet. They in turn fired back with what they had and whatever aircraft they could get in the air. The ferocity of this defense led Kurita to believe that he had indeed encountered the main force of the U.S. fleet, and he retreated quickly. Even though he retreated quickly, they had been able to sink several U.S. ships. The battle saw the Japanese completely outgun the Americans. Also, they launched an intimidating new weapon, the kamikaze. The first use of the kamikaze aircraft took place following the Leyte landing. A kamikaze hit the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia on 21 October, but organized suicide attacks by the Special Attack Force began during the closing phase of the battle off of Samar, causing the destruction of the escort carrier St. Lo. The battle off of Samar was a clear victory for the Japanese, but they were unable to capitalize fully on their superiority. The battle off of the Cape of Engano on October 25th was the result of Halsey moving much of his task force north to engage Admiral Ozawa's northern force. He did not reach them until October 25th, and the only confrontation that occurred was the defeat of a few of the Japanese aircraft. The Northern Force was not the strength of the Japanese fleet and were picked apart on October 26th by sortie after sortie of aircraft flown from the U.S.'s aircraft carriers. Among the ships sank was the carrier Zukaka, which was the last surviving ship from the attack on Pearl Harbor. This once again proved how superior the U.S. dive bombers were against the Japanese ships. This engagement only solidified the superiority that was felt by the U.S. force, and especially their aircraft carriers. On October 26th, the battle ended when the U.S. sank a few more of Ozawa's ships and then proceeded to attack from the air the ships as they retreated, bringing the Battle of Leyte Gulf to a close. On October 25th, while the U.S. fleet was engaging Ozawa off of Cape Ingano, Kinkaid and his 7th Fleet began to call for help from Halsey. This was partly due to its involvement in action the previous day off of Samar and in the Surigao Strait, but also because Kinkaid felt that he was running dangerously low on ammunition. This led to Halsey eventually detaching Task Force 34 to head back towards Samar. Halsey procrastinated in sending Task Force 34 back, and they never reached Samar to make any sort of contributions. This is just a further example of the lack of communication that existed between the U.S. fleets. This lack of communication was critical to the battle, but it could have had much worse consequences than it ended up having. The final attacks on the fleeing Japanese forces during the night of October 25th and 26th came in the form of American air attacks, which was quite fitting because American air superiority had been a decisive factor in victory for the U.S. The number of destroyed Japanese vessels paints a grim picture of the sheer level of catastrophe for the Japanese fleet. Japanese forces lost 26 vessels compared to the U.S. only losing 6. Japanese Admiral Ozawa stated that as a result of Leyte Gulf, surface forces became strictly auxiliary, so that we relied on land forces, special attacks, and air power. Prior to Leyte, there had been 2 main types of naval battles fought in the Pacific. There had been a short-range action where ships had attacked each other with gunfire or torpedoes, almost invariably under the cover of darkness, and there had been long-range actions between forces built around carriers which had struck at each other over hundreds of miles of sea. At Leyte Gulf, they were actively employed during the battle and even overlapped. After the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan ceased to be a naval power. It had suffered its greatest loss of ships and crew ever. Even though the heart of the naval battle was over and the Japanese had all but lost the Philippines, the fighting was far from over. The Battle of Leyte in the Pacific Campaign of World War II was the invasion and conquest of Leyte and the Philippines by American and Filipino guerrilla forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who fought against the Imperial Japanese Army in the Philippines led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita from 17 October to 31 December 1944. The battle launched the Philippines Campaign of 1944-1945 for the recapture and liberation of the entire Philippine archipelago and to end almost 3 years of Japanese occupation. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was a historical victory for American forces, and as Admiral Yonai, a naval minister for the Empire of Japan, stated, "I felt that it was the end."